He woke up at his own funeral and heard the worst secret. Think no one will find out? Daniel Westwood watched his wife, Isabelle, as she descended the stairs of their mansion. The elegant dress she wore seemed out of place for a dinner at home, but Isabelle always dressed as if she were about to attend a high-society event. There was something in the way she moved, in the coldness of her eyes, that had been unsettling Daniel for months. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual, though his mind was awash with doubts. Isabelle paused midway down the stairs and shot him a quick glance before responding. "No, darling. I just wanted to feel good, even at home. Is there something wrong with that?" Daniel forced a smile. "Of course not. I just thought maybe we had plans I'd forgotten about." She smiled back, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "You work too much, Daniel. You should relax a bit." The comment irritated him more than it should have. Daniel didn't like the idea that his wife thought he worked too much. He had always believed that constant effort was what had built his fortune, and Isabelle never seemed to mind that before. But now, something was different. The distance between them, which he had initially attributed to stress and fatigue, was growing wider. "Maybe you're right," he murmured, watching her walk toward the kitchen. His eyes followed her graceful movements, and he wondered for the 1,000th time what had changed. Where was the woman he had fallen in love with? The following days were marked by a growing sense of suspicion. Daniel noticed small details he would have previously ignored. Isabelle's nighttime outings, always with vague explanations. The phone call she took in a hushed voice, stepping away so he wouldn't hear. And the smiles that never seemed genuine. Isabelle was drifting away from him, and Daniel was determined to find out why. Finally, one night, he could no longer contain his anger. As they dined, the silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Daniel set his fork down with more force than he intended and looked directly at Isabelle. "Isabelle, what's going on with you? With us?" He couldn't hide the accusatory tone in his voice. She looked up from her plate, surprised by the sudden attack. "What are you talking about, Daniel? There's nothing wrong." "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm not an idiot. I know something is happening. You're not the same." Isabelle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You're getting paranoid, Daniel. Everything I do, you interpret in the worst possible way. Is that what our relationship has become?" The coldness in her words cut Daniel more deeply than he expected. "Maybe I am paranoid," he replied, controlling his tone, "but I won't ignore what I'm seeing. If something's going on, be honest with me." Isabelle sighed and shook her head as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Daniel, you're tired. You're stressed from work. You need to stop seeing things that aren't there. I'm your wife, and I'm here for you." "Then why does it feel like we're drifting further apart? Why do I feel like you're hiding something from me?" Isabelle stood up from the table, frustration clearly visible on her face. "You're being irrational, Daniel. I don't need this right now. I'm going to my room." She walked away quickly, leaving Daniel alone at the table with cold food in front of him and the bitter taste of distrust in his mouth. He wanted to believe Isabelle, wanted to believe he was imagining things. But something inside him, a persistent, dark voice, told him he was right to doubt. In the following days, the distance between them only grew. Daniel tried to focus on work, but the doubts haunted him. He began investigating discreetly, hiring a private detective to follow Isabelle and observe her movements. But surprisingly, the detective found nothing concrete. This only added to Daniel's frustration and feeling of helplessness. He knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it. And so, Daniel found himself trapped in a spiral of uncertainty and fear, a spiral that would eventually lead him to a discovery far more terrifying than he could have imagined. Daniel Westwood felt the weight of exhaustion as he looked out the window of the private jet that was taking him to an important business meeting in Chicago. The clouds below seemed like an endless sea, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of sorts. It was a different kind of tiredness, an exhaustion that had been creeping up on him for weeks, dragging over him like a shadow. In recent months, Daniel's life had become a whirlwind of suspicion and tension. His relationship with Isabelle was deteriorating, and doubts about her loyalty were ever present, like a constant background noise. He had sought distraction in work, as he always had, but lately, even that was becoming difficult. The first signs were subtle: a slight headache here, a pang of nausea there. Daniel, a man of robust health and disciplined routine, initially paid little attention. He attributed it all to stress. After all, it wasn't the first time he'd faced a tumultuous period, both in business and in his personal life. But as the days passed, the symptoms began to worsen. The physical exhaustion intensified, and he started having episodes of dizziness and vertigo. The night before his trip, he woke up drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding erratically, and for a brief moment, he felt a pang of fear. Something was definitely wrong. During the flight, while trying to focus on some documents, Daniel noticed that his vision seemed blurry. He blinked several times, trying to clear his eyes, but the haze persisted. His head ached, a dull, persistent pain he couldn't shake. He leaned back in the soft leather seat, closing his eyes for a moment. What if I'm really sick? He thought, the idea floating through his mind. He had always been healthy, never the type to worry about illness. But now, the weakness in his body made him reconsider. What he couldn't understand was how quickly his health had deteriorated. It all seemed to have started suddenly, as if something were corroding his vitality from the inside out. During dinner on the flight, he remembered something disturbing. The previous week, Isabelle had begun preparing his meals more often. Something that had previously been done by the chefs had suddenly become part of a new routine, she had suggested. Isabelle had insisted that she wanted to take care of him, that she knew how hard he was working and wanted him to feel more at home, more relaxed. At the time, the food had tasted delicious, a familiar touch that reminded him of happier times. He allowed himself to believe that perhaps Isabelle was trying to make amends, trying to bring them closer together. But now, with his body weak and his mind confused, that memory turned bitter. What if the caring gesture was actually part of something much more sinister? Daniel's head throbbed with growing suspicion. He wondered if he was imagining things, if paranoia was finally taking over him. But the symptoms couldn't be ignored. Something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Isabelle was somehow involved. Arriving in Chicago was difficult. Daniel nearly stumbled as he got off the plane, his legs feeling like rubber. He forced himself to maintain his composure, refusing the pilot's offer of help. He needed to appear strong, even if inside he was falling apart. Throughout the day, the symptoms worsened. During an important meeting, as one of his executives discussed numbers and strategies, Daniel felt the world around him begin to spin. His vision narrowed into a tunnel, and he realized with growing panic that he was about to pass out. I need to get out of here, he thought, standing up abruptly. But before he could take 2 steps, the floor seemed to disappear beneath his feet. The last thing he saw was the bright, white ceiling of the conference room spinning above him before everything went dark. Daniel remembered nothing else. When he opened his eyes again, he wasn't in a hospital room as he had expected, but in a deep void where sounds and lights were non-existent. His body didn't respond, and for a moment, he thought he was dead. So, this is how it ends, he thought in the midst of despair and confusion. The suspicions that had haunted him for weeks now seemed terrifyingly real. Isabelle had been poisoning him slowly, methodically, while he, blinded by the desire to restore his marriage, ignored the signs. Now it was too late to regret, too late to change anything. His life had come to an end, and all that remained was the void. Yet, Despite the paralysis that gripped him, Daniel's mind remained active. He didn't know what had happened after he passed out, but the void around him was not death, not yet. He was suspended somewhere between life and death, unable to move but conscious enough to realize there was still something to be done if only he could break free. As the darkness surrounded him, a single resolution took shape in his mind. He needed to find out the truth, and if he somehow made it out of this, he wouldn't let Isabelle and whoever her accomplice was escape unpunished. But for now, all he could do was wait and fight not to succumb to complete darkness. Daniel Westwood's body was transported back to the Westwood mansion, a property that had belonged to his family for generations. The mansion, with its high walls and imposing architecture, had always been a symbol of the Westwoods' power and wealth. But for Daniel, the place was much more than just a residence. It was the home where he had grown up, where he had learned about responsibility, legacy, and, ironically, about trust. Hidden within the property's walls, behind a dense grove, was the Westwood family's private cemetery, a secluded, almost sacred place where generations of Westwoods had been buried. It was a tradition that the body of each family member be laid in state at the mansion before being buried in this cemetery, ensuring that they remained together even in death. The preparations for Daniel's funeral were grand. Isabelle managed everything with an efficiency that was almost insensitive, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The dark mahogany coffin, adorned with gold details, was placed in the grand hall where visitors could pay their last respects. The room was decorated with white flowers, and the environment, illuminated by antique candelabras, gave the place an atmosphere that was both solemn and opulent. Throughout the day, the mansion was filled with friends, family, and important figures from society, all expressing their respects and tributes to the deceased. Isabelle was at the center of it all, maintaining a facade of grief and dignity, accepting condolences with a controlled expression. She seemed the perfect widow, composed and attentive, but behind her cold eyes, there was a calm, dark satisfaction. Daniel, however, was not completely unconscious. Trapped in his cataleptic state, he was slowly regaining consciousness. Though his body remained motionless, his mind began to adjust to the new reality. He could hear the murmurs of voices around him, feel the soft fabric that enveloped him in the coffin, and with each passing hour, he felt his life force returning, even if almost imperceptibly. Finally, the day came to an end, and the last guests began to leave. Isabelle thanked everyone for their presence and assured them that the burial would take place the next morning in a private ceremony at the family cemetery. When everyone was gone, the mansion was plunged into a heavy silence. In the hall, Isabelle remained beside the coffin, looking at Daniel's body with a pensive gaze. She was alone now, or at least she thought she was. Mark entered the room shortly after, silently approaching her. Isabelle glanced at him, and he responded with a malicious smile. "It's finally over," Mark murmured, looking at Daniel with disdain. "Yes," Isabelle replied with the same coldness. "He's out of the way, and soon everything he built will be ours." Mark looked at Isabelle, feeling victorious. "I never thought it would be so easy." "Easy?" Isabelle let out a low, bitter laugh. None of this was easy. He was suspicious, almost ruined everything several times. But now it's finished. The two remained silent for a moment, looking at the coffin as if admiring a completed work. But before they could continue, they decided it was best not to stay there any longer. Isabelle knew there was still one final step to be completed, and that was the burial. But for now, she was tired and longed for the quiet of her quarters. "Let's go," Isabelle said, pulling Mark by the hand. "Tomorrow will be the end of everything." The two left the hall, leaving Daniel's coffin alone in the vastness of the grand room. Silence reigned once more, but not for long. Later that night, Bob Carter, the Westwood family's oldest and most loyal servant, entered the hall to do the final cleaning and ensure everything was in order for the next morning's burial. Bob was a man who valued tradition and loyalty, and for that reason, he made a point of stopping by alone to say goodbye to Daniel. He approached the coffin with genuine sorrow. Daniel had been good to him and his family, and now seeing him there, supposedly lifeless, was a painful experience. As always in solemn moments, Bob murmured a brief prayer, asking for peace for Daniel's soul. But as Bob prepared to leave, something made him stop. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, in the corner of his vision. He turned slowly and looked at the coffin. There, in the dim light of the candelabras, he saw one of Daniel's fingers move. "Mr. Westwood?" Bob murmured, his voice full of disbelief and hope. Approaching quickly, he fixed his eyes on Daniel's face and noticed something even more surprising. There was a slight movement in his chest. Daniel was breathing, weakly but still breathing. "Mr. Westwood," Bob called again, this time with more urgency. Forcing himself to the limits of his strength, Daniel struggled to respond. His eyes opened slowly, meeting Bob's shocked gaze. He couldn't speak, couldn't move much, but the fact that his eyes were open was a clear sign. He was alive. Bob, still unable to fully believe what was happening, took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he needed to act quickly. Daniel was alive, but vulnerable. And with what he had heard earlier from Isabelle and Mark, Bob knew he couldn't trust anyone. He needed to get Daniel out of there before it was too late. Bob Carter could hardly believe what he was seeing. Daniel's eyes were open, though with difficulty, and he was breathing irregularly but steadily. The initial shock quickly gave way to action. Bob knew he didn't have much time. The next morning would bring the burial, and with it, the possibility that Daniel would be lost forever. "Mr. Westwood, can you hear me?" Bob whispered urgently, leaning closer. Daniel blinked slowly, his eyes trying to focus on Bob. He couldn't move much, but the force of his will was beginning to impose itself on his paralyzed body. The anger and horror over what he had heard were bringing him back faster than expected. Bob, realizing the need to bring Daniel back to full consciousness, acted quickly. He looked around for something he could use. He ran to a small side table where there was a tray with tissues, water, and a bottle of ammonia for use in case of fainting. He grabbed the bottle and returned to Daniel's side. "I'm going to help you, sir. I need you to take a deep breath," Bob said, opening the bottle and holding it close to Daniel's nose. The pungent smell of ammonia invaded Daniel's senses, provoking an immediate reaction. He inhaled with difficulty but deeply, and the intensity of the smell made him gasp. The olfactory shock acted as a brutal awakening, speeding up his circulation and pulling him back to control of his body. The effect was almost instant. Daniel began to blink more forcefully, and his fingers, which had barely moved before, now began to clench into a fist. Full consciousness was returning, and with it, the vivid memory of the conversation he had overheard. "Bob!" Daniel's voice was rough, weak but filled with determination. "I'm here, sir," Bob responded, trying to contain his own excitement. "Isabelle? She and Mark, they?" Daniel struggled to form words, but the anger was driving him. "They tried to kill me. They want everything, the company, the fortune." Bob felt a wave of horror as he heard Daniel's words. Now everything made sense. Isabelle's efficiency, the lack of genuine emotion in her grief. It was all a facade to cover up the deepest betrayal possible. "Mr. Westwood, we need to call the police immediately. This is a terrible crime. They must pay for this." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. When he opened them again, there was a calculated coldness in them, something Bob hadn't seen since the most challenging times in business. "No, Bob," Daniel replied, his voice firmer. "We're not calling the police." "Not yet." Bob looked at him incredulously. "But sir, they tried to kill you. They could try again." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Yes, they could. And they will. But we need to let them believe they succeeded. Let them continue with their plans until they hang themselves with their own rope." Bob was silent for a moment, processing Daniel's words. He knew that Daniel had always been a strategic man, someone who liked to have absolute control of situations. But this seemed like a huge risk. "What do you want us to do then?" Bob asked, loyalty overcoming hesitation. Daniel, still recovering, gathered the strength he had left and looked directly into Bob's eyes. "First, we need to get out of here. And then, we'll let them dig their own graves." Bob saw the seriousness in Daniel's gaze and knew there was no point in arguing. Daniel was determined to resolve this in a way that involved not just justice but also revenge. And Bob, as always, would stand by him, helping him every step of the way. "Let's get you out of here right away, sir," Bob said with determination, ready to act. Daniel nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long journey to reclaim his life and expose those who had betrayed him. Bob Carter knew that the task ahead of him was delicate. Daniel Westwood's life depended on the flawless execution of a plan that couldn't raise any suspicion. The next morning would bring the burial, and any mistake could cost not only Daniel's life but also his own. With Daniel's decision not to involve the police, Bob would need to be even more cautious and creative. After helping Daniel hide in an isolated part of the basement, Bob returned to the main hall where the coffin was still displayed and began preparing the next step. He knew that Daniel's body needed to disappear, but the coffin would still have to be buried as planned, with no one noticing the difference. When night fell and the mansion was enveloped in silence, Bob began working quickly, taking advantage of the moment when everyone was in their quarters. He needed a solution that was discreet and effective. Carefully, he pushed the coffin to a more secluded area where he could work without being interrupted. Using bags of dirt and stones he found in the back of the property, Bob began filling the coffin, ensuring that the weight was similar to that of a human body. He knew that the pallbearers the next day wouldn't notice the difference. Every movement was made with precision, and with each bag of dirt he placed, Bob felt the pressure mounting. One mistake, and the whole plan could collapse. As he worked, Bob knew he needed to inform Isabelle about the decision to close the coffin. It wouldn't be unusual for the coffin to remain open until the final moment, but he needed a reason to justify the early closure, something Isabelle wouldn't question. Once he finished preparing the coffin, Bob went up to Isabelle's quarters. He knocked gently on the door, waiting for permission to enter. Isabelle, who was sitting in an armchair casually reading a book, looked up when she saw him enter. "What is it, Bob?" she asked in a calm but distant voice. "Mrs. Westwood, I'm sorry to disturb you so late," Bob began, keeping his tone respectful. "But I believe it would be best to close Mr. Westwood's coffin before the burial in the morning." Isabelle raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Close it? I thought it would remain open until the end." Bob paused, choosing his words carefully. The time that the body has been exposed, even with the embalming, has begun to cause slight deterioration. It wouldn't be appropriate for anyone to see Mr. Westwood in a state that doesn't do justice to his memory. Isabelle observed him for a moment, and then, as if the decision had no importance, she shrugged and nodded. "Do whatever is necessary, Bob. I don't want anyone to see him in a way that isn't dignified." Her coldness impressed Bob, but he knew he couldn't show any reaction. He simply bowed his head and left the room, leaving Isabelle to return to her book without further questions. Back in the hall, now assured of Isabelle's approval, Bob closed the coffin with great care, making sure it was perfectly sealed. Everything was prepared for the burial, and no one would suspect a thing. The next morning, the funeral proceeded as planned. Isabelle, with her controlled expression, and Mark, staying on the sidelines, watched as the coffin was carried in procession to the Westwood family's private cemetery. The weight of the coffin, now filled with dirt and stones, deceived everyone. None of the pallbearers noticed the difference, and the coffin was buried with all the honors due to a member of the Westwood family. To all those present, Daniel Westwood was officially dead and buried. Meanwhile, Daniel, now hidden in the mansion's basement, began to regain his strength. Bob brought him food, water, and some clean clothes, ensuring he had everything he needed to recover. But Daniel knew he couldn't stay there for long. They needed a long-term plan, and he needed to start acting. Once he felt strong enough to move, Daniel asked Bob to help him relocate out of the mansion to a place where he could hide more effectively and start his investigations. Bob, ever loyal, had already thought of a location: a long-abandoned shed at the back of the property, covered by ivy and trees. It was the perfect hideout, isolated but close enough for Daniel to investigate and act quickly. In the days that followed, Daniel began to investigate in secret. Using a laptop that Bob provided, he started digging through documents, emails, and any communication that might have gone unnoticed by Isabelle and Mark. He knew he would need solid evidence to bring them down, and with his business experience, he knew exactly where to look. Meanwhile, Bob continued to carry out his duties at the mansion, keeping a low profile but always alert. He passed information to Daniel, reporting on Isabelle and Mark's movements, who now felt secure in their victory. But Daniel knew the war had just begun. He was coming back to life, not just physically but as a more determined and ruthless man than ever before. Isabelle and Mark had dug their own graves, and now it was only a matter of time before they fell into them. Hidden in the old shed at the back of the property, Daniel Westwood grew stronger with each passing day. His sharp, focused mind was determined to gather all the evidence needed to destroy those who had tried to take his life. With Bob Carter's help, he began to dig into the recent past of Isabelle and Mark, sifting through every corner of their lives for incriminating clues. Bob was instrumental in this process. Using his access to the mansion, he brought confidential documents, rifled through drawers and cabinets, and managed to capture compromising conversations that Isabelle and Mark believed were far from any prying ears. Technology was also on Daniel's side. On the laptop that Bob provided, Daniel was able to track emails, messages, and financial transactions that revealed a conspiracy much larger than he had imagined. The records showed the purchase of poison from a specialized pharmacy, with receipts coldly signed by Mark, disguising the purchase as a simple medication for a special patient. There were also messages exchanged between Mark and Isabelle, where they discussed in almost clinical terms the doses that would be administered to Daniel, calculating precisely when he would finally succumb. As Daniel continued to dig, he discovered that other executives in his company were also involved. They had been bribed to facilitate the transition of power to Isabelle and Mark after Daniel's death, ensuring that control of the company would smoothly pass into the hands of the traitors. But it was a conversation that Bob overheard while serving breakfast to Isabelle that lit the fuse for the next phase of Daniel's plan. Confident that Daniel was dead, Isabelle revealed to Mark that she planned to use his fortune to buy a series of properties in her name before dividing the remaining funds between them. This would allow Isabelle to establish herself as a powerful figure while Mark handled the internal operations of the company. When Bob brought this information back to Daniel, he knew he needed to act quickly. Isabelle and Mark were preparing to liquidate his accounts, but they didn't count on the fact that Daniel still had full control over the funds. That night, Daniel accessed his bank accounts and transferred all his fortune to a new account, one he had secretly prepared years earlier for emergencies. The money was now safe, out of Isabelle and Mark's reach. The next day, when they tried to access the accounts, they found them empty, leading to a confusion and panic that Daniel knew would only worsen. With the evidence in hand and knowing that time was on his side, Daniel decided it was time to involve the authorities. Discreetly, and with Bob's help, he went to the local police station. When he entered, the shock was immediate. The officers present, many of whom knew him, were stunned to see the dead man walk through the front door. Daniel introduced himself and told the whole story, handing over the evidence he had gathered. The police, after recovering from the surprise, immediately began organizing an operation to arrest Isabelle, Mark, and the accomplices in the company. As the police prepared, Daniel returned to the mansion. It was time to confront Isabelle and Mark face to face. He entered discreetly, using his familiarity with the property to avoid being seen. He made sure to wear the same suit from his funeral. He looked like a ghost. Approaching the living room, he heard raised voices. "How is this possible? All the money is gone." Mark shouted, clearly desperate. "I don't understand." Isabelle replied, her voice filled with frustration. "Everything was supposed to be in our hands. How could this have happened?" As they argued, Daniel entered the room, remaining in the shadows for a moment. In the middle of the argument, as they accused each other of stealing the fortune, Isabelle screamed, "It's as if that bastard won't leave me alone, even in death." That's when Daniel stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. "So, the bastard you're referring to has come back from the dead," Daniel said, his posture tall and his voice firm and cold. Isabelle and Mark froze, slowly turning to face the man they believed was buried. The horror on their faces was instant, followed by a mix of panic and disbelief. "But you're dead," Isabelle stammered, unable to process what she was seeing. "The dead don't speak, Isabelle," Daniel replied, a bitter smile on his face. "But ghosts, the ones you made me into, can do much more than that." Before they could react, the sound of sirens and the flashing lights of the police flooded the mansion. Officers quickly entered the room, weapons drawn, surrounding Isabelle and Mark, who were still paralyzed with shock. "It's over," Daniel said calmly as the police handcuffed the two. "Now you'll pay for everything you've done." As Isabelle and Mark were led away, Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His revenge was complete, but he knew that what mattered most was that his life, the one they had tried to steal, was back under his control. In the days that followed, Isabelle, Mark, and the accomplices in Daniel's company were formally charged with conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. The media, hungry for scandal, covered every detail of the case, turning Daniel into an almost mythical figure, the man who came back from the dead to expose the traitors in his life. Daniel, for his part, decided it was time to start over. The Westwood mansion, with all its painful memories, was sold. He chose to live more simply, but with the peace of mind he had longed for. Bob, ever by his side, was rewarded for his loyalty with a portion of the fortune and remained as a friend and confidant. While the city still buzzed about Daniel's surprising return, he looked to the future with a new purpose. Power, wealth, and revenge had been achieved, but now all Daniel wanted was to rebuild his life away from the shadows of the past. And so, the man who had once been buried rose again, not as a victim but as a survivor, ready for the next chapter of his life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.